So, we've heard from the political view, we've heard the Commission, we've heard two major benchmark providers, both having to be non-EU regulated benchmark providers. And I'm here to represent the view from a large asset manager, a buy-side firm. My name is Susanne from Dootingh. I work for State Street Global Advisors, so the asset management arm of State Street. Just to indicate how big we are, we manage around $2 trillion of assets under management. A large part of that is passive business, so indexing funds, ETFs, etc. So I thought it would be interesting to provide the perspective of how users of benchmarks, as defined in the current draft proposal, regard and think about the rules and requirements laid out in the proposal. In general, I think we would echo many of the comments provided by Anna and Pierre, but I think perhaps it's important to realize how we do our own due diligence and how we look at benchmarks as users. First of all, maybe just to clarify how asset managers acting as agents, managing money on behalf of end clients, be it institutional or retail, how we look at benchmarks and what we use them for. Clearly, we have no direct access to the benchmark setting processes, nor are we able to control the outcome or even manipulate benchmarks, nor do we use them to price financial instruments. I think this is a very important point to note. The initial draft of the proposal had a definition of users which seemed to indicate that all funds, by definition, use benchmarks as reference prices. A price or an NAV for fund is only determined by the assets held within the fund, never directly by the benchmark itself. So even if there would be issues with the benchmark, that does still not automatically mean that there would be issues with the funds that either track such a benchmark or use such a benchmark as a reference to compare the performance of the active manager relative to the benchmark. I would also note that as asset managers, we are already subject to quite strict criteria how and when to use benchmarks and what rules those benchmarks should comply with. There's rules in UCITS, there's rules in the AIFMD framework, there's rules, of course, in MAR framework. So we believe that there already is a stringent regulatory framework for users as benchmarks. More importantly, though, I think it's really, really critical to realize that asset managers, again, acting on behalf of the clients, have every incentive to do proper due diligence on the benchmarks we use. We've heard the internal governance principles and criteria used by both S&P and MSCI, and we, as a big benchmark user for our passive business, our ETFs, and our active funds, we would always only select those benchmarks for our funds which we believe are of high quality. And we would describe a high quality benchmark as one which is clearly rules-based, which is transparent, and where the benchmark provider is open to an ongoing debate with the users of those benchmarks. In other words, we have our own teams of people verifying the processes, rules, and transparency of the benchmarks that we use. We regularly engage with all benchmark providers that we use, and we would only use those benchmarks that are willing to engage with us. In other words, we truly believe that there is a strong self-regulatory pressure for asset managers to make sure we only use benchmarks of high quality. Put differently, there's no benefit to us to use benchmarks that would not be of high quality, because ultimately the outcome of an investment strategy is strongly linked to the quality of the benchmark that we choose for that strategy. It, of course, is also dependent on the asset manager's ability to actually track such a benchmark, which again is not the same thing as the benchmark itself. But there's absolutely no reason for us to choose a benchmark which we believe does not meet those high quality criteria that we adhere to. So, in other words, while we clearly understand the public outrage about all the scandals that indeed have been very widely publicized, and rightly so, and we understand the pressure that politicians are under to come up with a strong regulatory framework for all those benchmarks that are rate-setting benchmarks that can be used for products of retail investors, etc. We do believe that establish what we would call market benchmarks based on publicly available information might perhaps not be the right scope for this regulation because of the reasons I just mentioned, because we do our own due diligence, because there is no reason for us to use benchmarks that are not transparent, that are not rules-based, because that's not in the interest of the end client. In other words, we welcome the initiative for the regulatory proposal. We do recognize that certain benchmarks create systemic risks, but we would challenge the notion that a lot of the standards, especially the equity benchmarks, would in any shape or form constitute systemic risk. We just wonder, therefore, what the added value of such a regulation for such market indices would be. To put differently, if the scope would be maintained as it currently is, the additional governance requirements that the S&Ps, the MSCIs, and all other benchmark providers have to comply with, even though, as we just heard and learned, they already are undertaking work to comply with IOSCO principles. That's not the same thing as the EU regulatory proposal, of course. But the additional governance requirements that they will have to comply with will come at a cost. Now, we expect those costs, as many other costs of services that we use in the process of managing money on behalf of our clients, we expect those costs to be passed on to the users of those products, i.e. asset managers, and therefore ultimately the end investor. Given the due diligence that we already undertake for using these benchmarks, we therefore question whether those additional costs that would subtract from the net performance that the reform investor would receive would justify this very strict regulatory framework that is currently on the table. Moreover, and this is the point related to the third country regime, if the scope stays as it is, and therefore if users of benchmarks continue to be in scope for the regulatory proposal, which we clearly think should be up for debate. But if it stays as it is, and the third country regime, and we've heard extensively about this already, is indeed one of our major concerns. To give you some indication of why this is such a major concern for the asset management industry, FARM has undertaken a very high-level, rough and ready assessment of the number of European funds that currently use third country benchmarks. It's a rough and ready approach. It's nothing academic. But the first indications are that anywhere between 40 to 75% of equity funds are benchmarked against non-EU benchmarks. In our own case, SSGA, being one of the largest index providers in the world, 90% of our European equity funds are benchmarked against non-EU benchmarks. So, as we just heard from Alain and from Pierre, under the current proposal, the requirements for non-EU benchmark providers, in the absence of an equivalent regime in the US, are going to be challenging at best to comply with. What would that mean for asset managers like ourselves? In a worst case scenario, it would mean that we would have to change the benchmarks that we use for 90% of the equity funds that we offer to both institutional and retail investors in Europe. We doubt if those benchmarks that we use, which I can say it's public knowledge, tend to be the benchmarks of the two gentlemen represented here today. We believe those do represent robust, transparent, and widely tracked indices. In other words, we believe they represent good exposure to markets that our clients are asking for. So for us to be, in a worst case scenario, to be forced to change the benchmarks of all those, the 90% of those equity funds that we offer a year, would come with an additional layer of costs for our investors. It would come with costs associated with changing all the constituting documents of all those funds, and as this would probably be considered as a material change to the investment policies. We're talking about convening shareholder meetings, etc. That's a long, lengthy, and legally very expensive process. And on top of that, if you change to a different benchmark, it means you need to rebalance your funds. In other words, there would be an additional layer, and potentially quite a substantial layer, of transaction costs associated with changing to another benchmark provider. Is that in the best interest of the end investor? We would suggest that that question is part of the political debate. Another concern we would have regarding the third country regime and in general the governance requirements as they are currently drafted, is the impact it would have on competition and the emergence of new innovative benchmarks. We as an industry constantly look at new exposures that either our clients are asking for or that we believe provide interesting exposures as an additional exposure to the client's portfolio. For new benchmark entrants to have to comply with very strict criteria as currently drafted could well be a barrier to entry too high to hop over for those new entrants. So the end effect could well be the stifling of competition and a more restrictive offering of benchmarks for end investors to choose from. Again, we would question whether that's in the best interest of the end investor. There's many other smaller concerns we have around the proposal. I thought I'd just focus on those very key topics of scope, of end investors being defined as users being in scope, and the third country regime. Just one more point on the scope as a user. The requirements as laid out in the directive for users themselves in terms of the governance requirements for their due diligence of the benchmark provider are not that onerous. We already do it. So that's not the concern that we have. You're perfectly fine that we can completely comply with the requirements as they're currently drafted. It's an additional cost to what we consider to be very limited, if any, additional benefit to the end investor that